Program. Palestinians' formal entry into the International Criminal Court has ruffled feathers in Israel. Israel has called the move political, cynical, and hypocritical. To give us the Israeli perspective is Dr. Chuck Freilich. He is a former Deputy National Security Advisor to Israel. He joins us from Boston. Dr. Freilich, thanks for joining us.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
So, Palestinian membership of the ICC is now a done deal. It came into full force just a few days ago on April 1st. The ICC chief prosecutor is conducting a preliminary investigation. How will Israel respond to all of this?
Well, Israel may be forced to respond on the legal route as well, but I think this whole thing is unfortunate. It's actually part of the ongoing Palestinian tragedy. And that is that after nearly 70 years of Israel's independence, what the Palestinians are doing is trying to avoid the need for negotiations. The problem with negotiations is that you have to make concessions. The advantage of going through the legal route, going through the diplomatic route, is that they can put pressure on Israel. They can hurt Israel's image. The problem is that they can't reach a deal. So if the Palestinians really want to achieve what they say is their goal, an independent Palestinian state, they have to conduct negotiations. And if they want to go the legal route, they have to take into account that they are actually far more vulnerable to charges than Israel is. The fact is the Palestinian Authority is a dictatorship which was deeply, deeply involved in terrorism itself. Today you have the Hamas government in Gaza, which has fired thousands of rockets at Israel's civilian population centers, intentionally embeds its rockets in its own civilian population so that when Israel then exercises its legitimate right of defense, Palestinian civilians are killed. I think unavoidably and tragically. I think what we have to do is get back to serious negotiations.
Well, there is one body of opinion says that the aim behind this Palestinian move is to force the Israelis back to negotiations. They will internationalize the dispute. What do you believe is the aim of the Palestinians? I mean, why is it to force Israel back to the negotiating table? Because the negotiations are effectively stalled right now. They haven't been taking place for a long time.
Look, they don't have to force Israel back to the negotiating table. The people who walked away last year was President Abbas, not Prime Minister Netanyahu. So the question is whether we can hold talks. On at least 3 occasions in recent years, Israel put forward proposed proposals calling for a withdrawal from virtually 100% of the West Bank, and the Palestinians have walked away or rejected these proposals each time. It seems that the real problem here, it's not settlements. Everybody focuses on settlements. That's actually an easier issue. There are 2 or 3 issues that are far more difficult, and they're the essence of the problem. One is that the Palestinians are still demanding, after 70 years, a right of return. That's an absurd demand that no one in the international community thinks is realistic. They refuse to recognize Israel for what it is and for what the entire international community recognizes, the nation state of the Jewish people. They're going to have to make major concessions on Jerusalem. What they know is the real problem is that they don't want to make concessions on these issues, and so it's much easier to try and just go a legal route and undermine Israel's international image.
There is a Gaza-based human rights group which says that membership of the ICC would in effect be a deterrent against Israel conducting what it calls aggression against Palestinians. And that particular group says, look, there have been 3 wars against Gaza in the last 6 years. Israel has been able to carry out these wars because it hasn't been accountable. Now that the Palestinians belong to the ICC, Israel is going to be held accountable, and it might act as a deterrent.
Well, obviously that's what the Palestinians are trying to achieve. I wouldn't say that there were 3 wars against Gaza. That's a mischaracterization. There were 3 operations in which Israel exercised its right of self-defense because Gaza has been firing thousands and thousands of rockets at Israel. And as I said before, if they really want to go the legal route, they will expose themselves to actually far greater challenges.
Now, as we just heard, membership of the ICC for the Palestinians is a double-edged sword, as one American diplomat put it. This could also result in charges against Palestinian groups like Hamas, which, as you've just pointed out, have been firing rockets, unguided missiles at Israeli civilians. Will the Israelis push for charges to be brought against members of Hamas?
Well, I would imagine that Israel's going to have no choice, because if the Palestinians are waging this legal campaign and they're also waging a diplomatic campaign, then Israel in the end is going to have to be forced to respond in kind. But as I said before, this is unfortunate. This is tragic. The only way to resolve this conflict is to sit back at the negotiating table and for both sides to show a willingness to make major concessions. Israel has put a number of dramatic proposals on the table. The Palestinians have rejected every one of them. By the way, it's interesting, there has never once been a Palestinian peace proposal. There have been a number of Israeli proposals. So let's get back to the table and let's try and negotiate a negotiated outcome.
The Human Rights Monitoring Group, a respected human rights monitoring group, Human Rights Watch, its director, Kenneth Roth, said that there have been atrocities on both sides, and those atrocities have been so palpable, and those are his words, the ICC must act. It says whatever happened on both sides merits scrutiny by the ICC prosecutor. What do you make of that?
Look, the ICC may or may not decide to get involved in this issue. First of all, they have to decide whether there's even a basis for assuming that violations have been committed. Then they have to really go and investigate them in depth. That would be years from now before any of this really happens. Israel, in the meantime, has established its own legal fact-finding entities, committees to look into these events. And there have been a couple of indictments. In the course of a 2-month war, there may have been some soldiers who misbehaved, and Israel is investigating this. And indictments have been handed down. Hamas, of course, hasn't done anything other than to keep firing some rockets at Israel.
Right. Human Rights Watch makes reference to what you just told me as well, the fact that Israel has carried out its own investigations. It says that there have been military tribunals, but the worst that has happened, the worst punishment imposed on an Israeli soldier was 7.5 months for stealing a credit card.
Well, I don't know that that's the worst, and certainly these investigations are in their early stages. The point is that there's an Israeli judicial system looking into things. Israel didn't commit war crimes here. Okay, the whole thing is outrageous. The whole thing is fallacious. We have a dictatorship. We have a genocidal organization in Gaza, which calls for Israel's destruction, Israel's annihilation. Some of its leaders speak of Israel as being monkeys and dogs. They fire the missiles, and of course, then they accuse Israel of war crimes. This is outrageous. This is Alice in Wonderland. This is an inversion of the basic truth and justice. If anyone committed any serious offenses on the Israeli side, the investigations will look into them and take care of them. Let's see the Palestinians once set up an investigation. They don't do that.
Dr. Freilich, the Israelis have withheld Palestinian tax revenues. They released it just a few days ago, actually, in retaliation for the Palestinian move to seek membership of the International Criminal Court. Will the Israelis continue to use that tax revenues as leverage against the Palestinians?
Look, Israel's in a difficult position here because how do you cope with this? How do you deal with this entire onslaught? It's not just the one issue of use of funds. It's not just the ICC. The Palestinians are waging a military war against Israel, have been for decades, and in the last decade and a half by firing thousands and thousands of missiles. They're waging a diplomatic campaign, a legal campaign. So how do you respond? When you respond with force, the international community condemns you. If you try legal things, nobody really wants to see it go that route. You apply financial pressure, again, you're accused of improper practices. There aren't too many options. And what the Palestinians are trying to do, and with some success from their point of view, is make it even harder for Israel to use limited means of fighting back. So financial pressures are a tactic. Israel can only do it short term because Israel doesn't really want to see too much pressure put on the Palestinian Authority because the Palestinian Authority has to maintain law and order in the West Bank. And so, yes, there was a temporary suspension now. As you said, it's been restored. This may or may not happen. It'll probably happen again in the future, but it's part of an ongoing tit for tat. And it's short term.
Right. So what do you expect to happen in the months ahead? You know, as you pointed out, the chief prosecutor at the ICC is carrying out a preliminary investigation. We don't know what's going to come of that. I mean, do you expect to see some movement towards a negotiated solution?
Unfortunately, no. Because, as I said, the Palestinians say no to everything. And Israel has put a number of proposals on the table for an independent Palestinian state on virtually 100% of the territory, a division of Jerusalem, The only area in which Israel did not make a dramatic concession is on the right of return, so-called. No one in the international community supports that demand. So the Palestinians have to step up to the plate and show a willingness to make major concessions. The Israeli government will have to respond in kind. I'm unfortunately not optimistic that either side is going to do that for the foreseeable future. I think it's unlikely, tragically.